Welcome back, dear listener, to another soft-spoken stroll through the shadows of the past. Whether the night is just beginning for you, or you're listening as sleep slowly arrives, I'm happy you've chosen to spend this time here with me. Let me know in the comments. Are you listening from somewhere far and quiet, or in the heart of a busy city winding down? And if these calming explorations bring a sense of rest, please consider subscribing. There are countless more voices from the past still waiting to be heard. This isn't just another tale of Roman excess. This is the story of a woman who wielded influence over the most powerful man on earth, who challenged every social boundary of her time, and whose downfall would echo through history as one of the most dramatic political scandals ever recorded. By the end of this journey, you'll understand not just who Livia Aurelia was, but how her choices rippled through the empire, ultimately sealing her fate in ways that still captivate historians today. But before we unravel this web of passion and politics, let me share something that might surprise you. Modern historians have spent decades trying to separate fact from fiction in Livia's story because the accounts we have were written by men who lived in a society that both feared and respected powerful women. What we're about to explore isn't just Livia's story. It's a window into how history itself can become a battleground between truth and interpretation. The calculated Rizai. I'm going to take you through 5 pivotal moments that defined Livia's rise and fall, each more shocking than the last. We will explore her calculated ascent to power, her bold public behavior that challenged Roman society, her political maneuvering that influenced senators and freedmen alike, her ultimate act of defiance that crossed every line, and finally the swift retribution that ended her life at just 22 years old. Picture Rome in the year 38 CE. The unpredictable Emperor Caligula has just been eliminated, and in the chaos that follows, an unlikely figure emerges as the new ruler. Claudius Germanicus, the stammering, limping scholar whom everyone had dismissed as unfit for power, suddenly finds himself emperor of the known world. He's 50 years old, unmarried since his divorce, and desperately in need of legitimacy. Enter Livia Aurelia, barely 16, beautiful beyond measure, and possessing something Claudius desperately needs: the right bloodline. Livia wasn't just any young Roman woman. Her family tree read like a who's who of imperial power. Her great-grandmother was Octavia, sister of Augustus himself. Her mother descended from Marcus Antonius. In her veins flowed the blood of Rome's founding dynasty, making her more blue-blooded than many emperors. When Claudius married her, he wasn't just taking a wife. He was cementing his claim to the throne through her ancestry. But here's where the story takes its first dark turn. Livia understood her value from the very beginning. While Roman wives were expected to be silent, supportive figures who managed households and bore children, Livia had different plans. She recognized that her bloodline gave her leverage, and she intended to use every drop of it. Within a year of their marriage, she gave birth to Tiberius, Claudius's first legitimate male heir. Suddenly, she wasn't just the emperor's wife. She was the mother of Rome's future ruler. This elevated her status exponentially, but it also painted a target on her back in the deadly game of Roman politics. Being close to power meant being close to danger, and Livia was about to discover just how treacherous the proximity could be. The shadow government, the early years of her marriage revealed a woman of extraordinary cunning. While Claudius struggled with the complexities of ruling an empire, dealing with rebellious provinces, managing the Senate, and overseeing massive public works projects, Livia began building her own power base. She cultivated relationships with influential freedmen who had the emperor's ear. She positioned herself as a patron to ambitious young nobles. Most importantly, she learned to read Claudius's weaknesses and exploit them. Claudius, despite his intelligence, was remarkably trusting about human nature. His academic mind could grasp complex legal principles and historical precedents, but he often missed the subtle machinations happening right under his nose. Livia quickly realized that her husband's trust could be weaponized. When she whispered warnings about potential threats to his reign, he listened. When she suggested appointments or removals of officials, he often complied. Without realizing it, Claudius was allowing his young wife to accumulate unprecedented influence over imperial affairs. But power, especially power gained through manipulation, comes with its own intoxicating effects. As Livia's influence grew, so did her appetite for more. The quiet behind-the-scenes maneuvering that had marked her early years as Empress began to give way to increasingly bold and public displays of her authority. She started appearing at gladiatorial games with an entourage that rivaled the emperor's own. She began receiving petitions from citizens seeking imperial favor. Most shocking of all, she started making decisions that affected the lives and deaths of Rome's elite. The transformation wasn't lost on Roman society. Whispers began circulating through the city's taverns, bathhouses, and marketplaces. The Empress was overstepping her bounds. She was forgetting her place. She was becoming dangerous. But these whispers, rather than intimidating Livia, seemed to energize her. She had tasted real power, and she wanted more. The gatherings of power, this hunger would manifest in ways that astounded even jaded Roman society. Livia began hosting elaborate gatherings at the imperial palace, events that pushed every boundary of acceptable behavior. These weren't merely social occasions. They were displays of her influence, carefully orchestrated to show Rome's elite exactly who held real power in the empire. Senators who had once looked down on her as a mere girl now found themselves competing for invitations to her gatherings, knowing that her favor could make or break their careers. The parties themselves became legendary for their excess. Ancient sources described feasts that lasted for days, entertainment that shocked even Romans accustomed to spectacle, and guest lists that included everyone from senators and generals to actors and gladiators. This mixing of social classes was itself revolutionary in a society built on rigid hierarchies. But Livia seemed to delight in breaking these ancient taboos. More troubling still were the reports of what happened at these gatherings. Livia allegedly used these occasions to gather intelligence on potential rivals, to negotiate political alliances, and to identify threats to her position. What appeared to be mere hedonistic revelry was actually a sophisticated information-gathering operation with the Empress at its center, cataloging the weaknesses, desires, and secrets of Rome's most powerful figures. But perhaps most dangerous of all was how these events affected Livia herself. Each successful manipulation, each display of her influence, each moment of wielding power over men who should have been her superiors fed a growing sense of invincibility. She began to believe that she was untouchable, that her combination of imperial blood, political cunning, and personal charisma made her immune to the consequences that destroyed lesser mortals. The blood begins to flow, now comes the blood. Because once Livia had tasted the intoxicating rush of bending Rome's most powerful men to her will, once she had proven that her beauty and bloodline could open any door, close any mouth, or seal any fate, the logical next step wasn't restraint. It was elimination. The first to fall was Marcus Ventidius, a senator whose only crime was possessing something Livia wanted, his wife. Not his wife's affection, mind you, but her social position, her connections, her usefulness in Livia's growing web of influence. When Ventidius proved resistant to Livia's subtle suggestions that he divorce his spouse for the good of the empire, he found himself accused of treason. The evidence was thin, manufactured, almost laughably transparent to anyone who cared to look closely. But who was going to challenge the Empress? Who was going to risk their own neck by questioning her judgment? Claudius signed the death warrant without hesitation. His trust in his young wife had become absolute, dangerous in its completeness. When Livia whispered that Ventidius posed a threat to their son Tiberius, when she painted pictures of conspiracy and rebellion, the emperor saw only a loving mother protecting their family's future. The reality that his wife was systematically removing anyone who might limit her power never crossed his scholarly mind. Ventidius died quietly, efficiently, as enemies of the state were meant to die. His widow, suddenly available and grateful for Livia's protection, became a valuable addition to the empress's inner circle. The message to Rome's elite was unmistakable. Cooperation would be rewarded. Resistance would be eliminated. But here's what made Livia truly terrifying. She didn't stop at political enemies. She began targeting anyone who possessed something she coveted, anyone who had slighted her, anyone whose very existence reminded her that she wasn't yet untouchable. Asinius, one of Rome's wealthiest men, owned gardens that Livia admired. His reluctance to sell them to her at the price she offered sealed his fate. Accusations of corruption followed, then a trial, then execution. The gardens became part of the imperial estate. Julia Drusilla, Caligula's sister and a woman whose imperial bloodline rivaled Livia's own, represented a different kind of threat. She was beautiful, intelligent, and possessed the kind of natural gravitas that drew supporters without effort. Worse, she was unmarried, making her a potential bride for any ambitious general or senator looking to legitimize their own claims to power. Livia couldn't allow such a wild card to remain in play. The art of destruction, the destruction. Livia couldn't allow such a wild card to remain in play. The art of destruction, the Veon claims to power. Livia couldn't allow such a wild card to remain in play. Destruction of Julia Drusilla showcased Livia's evolving sophistication in the art of character destruction. Rather than crude accusations of treason, she orchestrated a more subtle campaign. Rumors began circulating about Julia's private life, her alleged affairs, her supposed plots against the emperor. These whispers, carefully planted and nurtured by Livia's network of informants, gradually poisoned Claudius against his own niece. When the final accusations came, adultery with the philosopher Seneca, conspiracy against the throne, they seemed almost inevitable. Julia Drusilla was exiled to a remote island where she died under mysterious circumstances, officially from illness, though everyone understood the truth. Seneca himself narrowly escaped execution, saved only by Livia's calculation that his death might create a martyr. Instead, he was exiled, neutralized but alive, a living reminder of what happened to those who crossed the empress. With each successful elimination, Livia's methods grew more refined, more devastating. She learned to use Rome's own institutions against her enemies. The courts, the Senate, the very legal system that was supposed to protect Roman citizens became weapons in her arsenal. She discovered that the right accusation delivered at the right moment to the right audience could destroy anyone, regardless of their wealth, connections, or innocence. More chilling still was how she began to enjoy the process. Ancient sources describe her attending the trials of her victims, watching from the imperial box as men she had marked for death pleaded for their lives. She would study their faces, their gestures, their final moments of hope before the inevitable verdict. This wasn't just political calculation anymore. It had become a form of entertainment, a way of asserting her dominance over life and death itself. The dangerous game, the psychological transformation, was complete. The ambitious girl who had married Claudius for security and status had evolved into something Rome had never seen before, a woman who wielded imperial power not through influence or manipulation, but through fear. Senators began to watch their words around her. Wealthy citizens started making discreet gifts to curry her favor. Even the Praetorian Guard, sworn to protect the imperial family, began to treat her with the wary respect usually reserved for the emperor himself. But power built on terror has its own unstable foundation. Each execution, each exile, each demonstration of her reach created new enemies, even as it silenced existing ones. The families of her victims didn't forget. The friends of the dead didn't forgive. Most dangerous of all, the very institutions she was using to eliminate her enemies were beginning to understand how thoroughly they had been compromised of Narcissus. Claudius's most trusted freedman and secretary was the first to recognize the true scope of what was happening. As the man responsible for managing the emperor's correspondence and appointments, he could see patterns that others missed. The steady stream of accusations flowing through Livia's network, the convenient timing of deaths and exiles, a systematic removal of anyone who might pose even a theoretical threat to the empress's growing power. Narcissus faced an impossible choice. Confronting Livia directly would be death. She had already demonstrated her ability to destroy far more powerful enemies. But allowing her to continue unchecked threatened not just individual lives, but the stability of the empire itself. If the emperor's wife could eliminate senators and nobles at will, if she could manipulate the legal system with impunity, if she could rule through terror while Claudius remained oblivious, then Rome itself was in mortal danger. The gathering storm, the solution, when it came to him, was elegant in its simplicity. Rather than attack Livia directly, he would document everything. Every suspicious death, every convenient exile, every pattern of behavior that suggested conspiracy rather than coincidence. He began building a case, not for immediate use, but for the moment when it might be needed. Because Narcissus understood something that Livia, intoxicated by her apparent invincibility, had forgotten. In Rome, no one stayed on top forever. Meanwhile, the empress continued her deadly games, unaware that her most dangerous enemy wasn't a rival woman or a jealous senator, but a quiet freedman who understood the power of information. She had grown so confident in her ability to eliminate threats that she had stopped looking for them in unexpected places. This blindness to gathering danger would prove to be her first critical mistake. But even as Narcissus quietly gathered evidence, Livia was preparing for her most audacious move yet. Having conquered the world of Roman politics through fear and manipulation, having bent senators and nobles to her will, having turned the imperial court into her personal kingdom, she was ready to claim something that no Roman woman had ever dared to pursue: actual political office, real governmental power exercised in her own name rather than through her husband. The ultimate ambition. The precedent she was contemplating would have shocked Augustus himself. Roman women, no matter how noble their birth or how vast their wealth, were forbidden from holding magistracies, commanding armies, or exercising formal political authority. They could influence policy through their male relatives, but they could never rule directly. Livia was about to challenge this fundamental law of Roman civilization. Her target was the consulship itself, the highest elected office in the Roman state. True, the consulship under the empire was largely ceremonial, with real power concentrated in the emperor's hands, but it retained enormous symbolic importance. The consuls were the heirs of the men who had founded the Republic, the successors to Brutus and the other heroes who had expelled the last king. For a woman to claim such an office would be revolutionary, unprecedented, and utterly unthinkable to traditional Roman minds. Yet Livia began to lay the groundwork with characteristic cunning. She started by suggesting that certain consulships should be reserved for members of the imperial family, ostensibly to honor their service to the state. She proposed that the emperor's relatives should be given precedence in elections, ensuring that only the most loyal candidates could hold high office. These suggestions, presented as reforms to strengthen imperial authority, actually served to normalize the idea that birth and family connection rather than merit or popular support should determine who held power. The forbidden romance, the moment that would define everything, came not through careful planning or political calculation, but through a single glance across a crowded amphitheater. Gaius Silius, the most handsome man in Rome, caught Livia's eye during the gladiatorial games celebrating Claudius's triumph in Britain. He was everything the emperor wasn't. Young, athletic, devastatingly beautiful, with a kind of magnetic presence that made crowds turn to stare when he entered a room. But Silius represented far more than mere physical attraction. He was a senator from an ancient patrician family, a man whose bloodline stretched back to the earliest days of the Republic. His grandfather had been a consul, his father a respected general who had died fighting Germanic tribes. In choosing him, Livia wasn't just selecting a lover. She was claiming the very essence of Roman nobility for herself. The seduction began immediately. Within days of that first meeting, Silius found himself receiving invitations to private dinners at the palace. Livia deployed every weapon in her considerable arsenal: her beauty, her wit, her power, her promises of advancement. She spoke to him of poetry and philosophy, subjects that revealed an intelligence far beyond what most men expected from even an educated woman. She listened to his political opinions with the kind of focused attention that made him feel like the most important person in the empire. Most intoxicating of all, she shared with him glimpses of the real power she wielded. She showed him correspondence from provincial governors seeking her guidance. She let him witness her private audiences with senators and military commanders. She made him understand that he wasn't just courting the emperor's wife. He was being invited into partnership with the most influential woman in the known world, the dangerous Alliance. Silius, despite his noble birth and political experience, was completely unprepared for this level of seduction. Roman women of his acquaintance were either dutiful wives focused on household management or courtesans skilled in physical pleasure but lacking in political sophistication. Livia represented something entirely new, a woman who combined devastating sensuality with genuine intellectual engagement and unprecedented political power. Within weeks, he was utterly captivated. Their relationship began in the shadows, conducted through carefully orchestrated meetings in private villas, secret rendezvous in gardens owned by Livia's supporters, stolen moments during public ceremonies where they could exchange meaningful glances while maintaining the facade of casual acquaintance. But secrecy had never satisfied Livia for long. Having proven that she could seduce Rome's most eligible bachelor, having demonstrated once again her irresistible appeal, she wanted more. She wanted recognition, acknowledgement, the kind of open relationship that would force Roman society to accept her choices, regardless of their shock or disapproval. The first sign of her changing attitude came during the Saturnalia festival, Rome's annual celebration of social inversion, where normal rules were temporarily suspended. Livia appeared at the public festivities with Silius at her side, not as a discreet escort, but as an obvious companion. They shared wine from the same cup, laughed at each other's jokes, exchanged touches that left no doubt about the nature of their relationship. The point of no return. The point. Reaction was immediate and electric. Romans who had grown accustomed to their empress's unconventional behavior found themselves confronted with something that crossed entirely new lines. Relationships among the elite were common enough, but they were conducted discreetly, with at least a pretense of maintaining proper appearances. Open relationships, flaunted publicly by the emperor's wife, were unprecedented and deeply shocking. But the public display served Livia's purposes perfectly. By forcing Roman society to confront her relationship with Silius, she was testing their willingness to accept her choices simply because of who she was. Would they condemn her, risking her wrath and potential retaliation? Or would they find ways to rationalize her behavior, proving once again that her power transcended normal social boundaries? The answer revealed the true extent of her influence. While private conversations buzzed with scandal and outrage, public reaction remained muted. Senators who might have spoken out against any other woman's behavior found themselves calculating the potential consequences of criticizing the empress. Wealthy citizens who were shocked by her conduct nevertheless sent gifts and invitations, hoping to maintain her favor. Even religious leaders who should have condemned such flagrant violation of marriage vows remained diplomatically silent. This acquiescence intoxicated Livia beyond measure. She had openly violated one of Roman society's most fundamental taboos and faced no meaningful consequences. If she could conduct a public relationship with impunity, what other boundaries might prove equally fragile? What other rules might bend before the reality of her power? The wedding that shook Rome, what she devised next, would have been unthinkable to any previous generation of Romans. She wanted marriage, not a secret ceremony or a private commitment, but a full Roman wedding complete with all the traditional rituals, witnessed by the city's elite, celebrated as a public festival. She wanted to marry Silius while remaining married to Claudius, creating an unprecedented situation that would force Roman law and custom to accommodate her desires. The idea was breathtaking in its audacity. Roman marriage was a sacred institution governed by centuries of legal tradition and religious ritual. Multiple marriages were not merely illegal, they were considered an offense against the gods themselves. Multiple marriages were not merely illegal, they were considered an offense and illegal. They were considered an offense against the gods themselves, a violation of divine law that threatened the entire cosmic order. For the emperor's wife to commit such an act would be revolutionary beyond measure. Yet, Livia began planning exactly such a ceremony. She consulted with priests about the necessary rituals, commissioned artists to design decorations, sent invitations to Rome's most important families. She approached the project with the same methodical precision she had applied to her political machinations, treating the impossibility of her goals as merely another obstacle to overcome through careful planning and ruthless execution. The fatal celebration, the morning of October 15th, dawned crisp and clear. The kind of Roman autumn day that poets would later claim the gods themselves had crafted for momentous occasions. In her private chambers, Livia awoke before sunrise, her mind already racing through the final preparations for what would become the most audacious ceremony in Roman history. Today, she would marry Silius while remaining the wife of Emperor Claudius. Today, she would shatter every convention that had governed Roman society for 8 centuries. But 60 miles away in Ostia, another drama was unfolding. Narcissus had finally played his hand, presenting Claudius with documentation so comprehensive, so damning, so irrefutable that even the emperor's legendary capacity for denial crumbled in the face of overwhelming evidence. The freedman had waited years for this moment, carefully building his case. And now he watched as understanding dawned across Claudius's scholarly features. The emperor's reaction was not the explosive rage that Narcissus had expected. Instead, Claudius seemed to age a decade in moments, his shoulders sagging as he absorbed the reality of what his beloved wife had become. The man who could recite complex legal precedents from memory, who could debate the finer points of historical interpretation for hours, found himself speechless in the face of personal betrayal so complete it defied comprehension. The trap springs. What hurt most wasn't the relationship itself. Roman marriages among the elite often accommodated such arrangements with discreet understanding. What devastated Claudius was the systematic nature of Livia's deception, the way she had weaponized his trust, turned his love into a tool for her own advancement. Every tender moment they had shared, every political decision she had influenced, every assurance of loyalty she had offered, now appeared in a new and terrible light. Narcissus, recognizing the emperor's shock, pressed his advantage with clinical precision. He produced letters proving Livia's role in political executions. He showed evidence of her shadow government, complete with records of the appointments she had made and the policies she had implemented, without imperial authorization. Most damning of all, He presented testimonies from witnesses who had seen her with Silas, descriptions so detailed and consistent that denial became impossible. But the freedman's masterstroke was revealing the wedding plans. This wasn't merely about relationships or even unauthorized governance. This was treason on an unprecedented scale. By marrying another man while remaining empress, Livia was attempting to create a dual imperial household, effectively splitting the monarchy itself. The legal implications were staggering, the precedent terrifying, the threat to imperial stability absolute. The emperor's wrath as Claudius absorbed this information. His shock began transforming into something far more dangerous. Cold, calculating fury. The gentle scholar who had preferred books to battles, who had ascended to the throne almost by accident, suddenly revealed the steel that had kept him alive through decades of palace intrigue. His voice, when he finally spoke, carried an authority that even Narcissus had never heard before. The orders came rapid fire, each one precise and final. Trusted centurions were summoned and given sealed instructions. Messages were dispatched to Rome with unprecedented urgency. Most crucially, the Praetorian Guard units, still loyal to the emperor rather than his wife, were quietly alerted and positioned for what was to come. Claudius had learned statecraft from watching Augustus, Tiberius, and even Caligula. He understood that decisive action, once begun, must be completed without hesitation. Meanwhile, in Rome, the wedding preparations reached their crescendo, an atmosphere of fevered excitement and barely suppressed terror. Everyone involved understood they were participating in something revolutionary, but few had fully grasped the enormous risks they were assuming. The guest list read, like a catalog of Rome's most powerful families, each name representing not just an individual, but entire networks of political and economic influence. The fall of an empress, the trap was sprung with military precision as sunset painted the Roman hills in shades of gold and crimson. As the wedding feast reached new heights of celebration, as Livia and Silas basked in the adulation of their guests, Praetorian forces surrounded the villa with silent efficiency. The party continued for precious minutes more, unaware that their world was about to collapse around them. The first sign of trouble came when servants began disappearing from their duties, called away by urgent messages they couldn't explain. Then musicians stopped playing mid-song, distracted by sound from outside that didn't belong to any celebration. Finally, a guest near the villa's entrance noticed armed figures moving through the gardens with the purposeful stride of men, carrying out official orders. The transformation from celebration to catastrophe happened with breathtaking speed. One moment, the assembled crowd was toasting the success of the most audacious wedding in Roman history. The next, they found themselves facing Praetorian centurions whose presence could mean only one thing. The emperor knew everything, and retribution was at hand. Livia's reaction revealed both her remarkable composure and her fatal miscalculation of her own position. Even faced with armed soldiers carrying imperial orders, she maintained the regal bearing that had carried her through so many previous crises. She demanded to know by what authority they dared interrupt a private ceremony, insisting that her status as empress protected both herself and her guests from arbitrary interference. But the centurion's response shattered her illusions with brutal clarity. He carried sealed orders bearing Claudius's personal seal, commands that superseded any authority she might claim. The emperor had spoken, and his word was law, even for the wife who had believed herself beyond the reach of consequences. The final judgment, arrest, was conducted with the respect due to her imperial status, but its implications were unmistakable. As Praetorian guards escorted Livia from the villa, as her guests scattered in terror, as the wedding feast was abandoned to servants and scavenging birds, the most powerful woman in Rome discovered that power built on deception and maintained through fear had limits that even she could not transcend. Silas, watching his bride disappear into imperial custody, faced a choice that would define his final hours. He could attempt to escape, hoping his family connections and senatorial status might provide some protection. He could throw himself on Claudius's mercy, pleading ignorance of the full implications of his actions, or he could accept responsibility for his choices with the dignity expected of a Roman nobleman facing inevitable death. His decision revealed the character that had attracted Livia in the first place. Rather than fleeing or groveling, Silius requested permission to return to Rome under guard, asking only that he be allowed to face his fate with honor intact. The centurion, recognizing courage even in a condemned man, granted this final request with the professional respect that soldiers accorded to worthy opponents. The price of ambition. The legal proceedings that followed would become models for imperial justice studied by jurists for generations. Every precedent was carefully examined, every principle of Roman law meticulously applied, every decision documented with the thoroughness that Claudius brought to all his scholarly endeavors. This wasn't a show trial designed to justify predetermined conclusions. It was a genuine attempt to apply Roman legal traditions to circumstances that no previous generation had ever imagined. Livia's defense, such as it was, relied on arguments that revealed both her desperation and her continued failure to understand the gravity of her situation. Her advocates claimed that the wedding ceremony had been a symbolic gesture rather than a legal marriage, a celebration of friendship that had been misinterpreted by hostile observers. They argued that her previous service to the empire, her successful governance during Claudius's absences, her role as mother to the imperial heir, all deserved consideration in determining her fate. But the evidence was overwhelming, the witnesses numerous, the implications undeniable. The documentation that Narcissus had compiled over years of careful observation painted a picture of systematic deception and escalating transgression that made denial impossible. Most damning of all was Livia's own behavior at the wedding, her obvious joy in the ceremony, her public acknowledgement of Silius as her husband while remaining married to the emperor. The end of an era. The trial's most dramatic moment came when Livia herself was brought before the court. Even in chains, even facing certain death, she retained the bearing that had made her the most compelling woman in Rome. Her beauty remained undiminished, her intelligence undimmed, her charisma still powerful enough to make even her accusers pause and consider the magnitude of what they were destroying. Spoke in her own defense with eloquence that reminded everyone present why she had wielded such influence for so many years. Her voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to command, the passion of someone fighting for her life, the desperation of someone who finally understood that her remarkable run of success had reached its end. She didn't deny the facts of her case, but attempted to reframe them, to present her actions as service to Rome rather than betrayal of it. Her argument was sophisticated, almost compelling in its audacity. She claimed that her marriage to Silius had been motivated by political necessity rather than personal desire. Claudius was aging, she argued, and the succession needed to be secured through alliances that would ensure stability after his death. Her relationship with Silius represented an attempt to bind the old senatorial families to the imperial cause, creating unity through marriage rather than division through suspicion. Furthermore, she contended that her administrative activities during Claudius's absences had been essential for maintaining imperial effectiveness. The empire was too vast, too complex for any single ruler to manage effectively. Her shadow government had filled crucial gaps, resolved important disputes, maintained stability in ways that formal channels could not have achieved. The verdict, but eloquence couldn't overcome evidence, and vision couldn't excuse treason. The court's verdict was never in doubt, though the reasoning behind it revealed important principles about the limits of imperial power and the requirements of Roman law. Livia's fate was sealed not just by her actions, but by the precedent that those actions would set if allowed to stand unpunished. The judges emphasized that Roman marriage was a sacred institution that couldn't be redefined to accommodate political convenience or personal preference. The emperor's household served as a model for all Roman families, and corruption at the imperial level threatened the moral foundations of the entire empire. Most crucially, the concentration of power in any single individual, regardless of their capabilities or intentions, violated the balance of authorities that had sustained Roman civilization for centuries. The sentence, when it came, surprised no one who understood Roman law, but its implementation revealed Claudius's continued struggle between justice and mercy. Death was inevitable, but the emperor granted his wife the dignity of choosing her manner of departure. She could face execution with the courage expected of a Roman noble, or she could take her own life in privacy, sparing herself and her family the public spectacle of imperial retribution. This final gesture of consideration reflected the complex emotions that continued to war within Claudius. He could condemn her actions while still remembering the woman he had loved. He could uphold Roman law while acknowledging the genuine feelings that had once bound them together. Most importantly, he could demonstrate that imperial justice operated through principle rather than personal vindictiveness, that even the most serious crimes could be punished with dignity intact. The final act, Livia's response to this offer, revealed the character that had driven her extraordinary rise and precipitated her catastrophic fall. She rejected the opportunity for private demise, choosing instead to face death publicly, defiantly, in a manner that would force Rome to confront the full implications of what they were destroying. Even in defeat, she sought to control the narrative, to shape how her story would be remembered and interpreted by future generations. Her final hours were spent not in lamentation or regret, but in careful preparation for a death that would serve as her ultimate political statement. She composed letters to be delivered after her execution, messages that would ensure her version of events reached sympathetic audiences throughout the empire. She arranged for the care of servants who had been loyal during her years in power, demonstrating the personal qualities that had inspired such devotion among those who knew her best. Most significantly, she spent time with her children, particularly Tiberius, the son whose birth had elevated her to unprecedented heights of influence. These conversations, conducted under guard in the shadow of approaching death, represented her attempt to shape how the next generation of the imperial family would understand her legacy. She wanted them to see her not as a criminal who had betrayed their father, but as a woman who had dared to envision new possibilities for Roman civilization. Legacy of ambition. The execution itself, when it finally came, was conducted with the formal precision that marked all imperial ceremonies. Livia faced her fate with composure that impressed even her enemies, speaking final words that would be debated by historians for centuries to come. She died as she had lived her final years, boldly, dramatically, in a manner designed to force observers to confront uncomfortable questions about power, gender, and the nature of Roman society itself. Her death marked the end of the most extraordinary political career in Roman history, but it also marked the beginning of a different kind of influence. The questions she had raised, the boundaries she had challenged, the precedents she had set, all survived her physical destruction. Future empresses would remember her example, both as inspiration and warning. Future emperors would grapple with the administrative innovations she had pioneered. Future historians would struggle to separate the woman from the legend, the achievements from the crimes, the revolutionary vision from the tragic overreach. In the immediate aftermath of her execution, Rome experienced a strange mixture of relief and loss. The impossible situation that had developed during her final years was resolved, but the resolution came at the cost of destroying someone whose intelligence, charisma, and political skills had genuinely impressed those who observed them firsthand. The empire was safer without her, but it was also diminished by her absence. Deprived of a voice that had articulated possibilities most Romans had never imagined, the emperor's reckoning Claudius himself, having demonstrated the resolve necessary to eliminate the greatest threat to his reign, now faced the equally challenging task of rebuilding trust and stability in the imperial system. The network of relationships, obligations, and innovations that Livia had created couldn't simply be dismantled overnight. Many of her administrative reforms had proved effective and would need to be continued under different leadership. Many of her supporters retained their positions and would need to be managed carefully to prevent future conspiracies. Most importantly, the emperor had to address the broader questions that his wife's career had raised about the nature of imperial power itself. Her success in exercising authority, even through unofficial channels, had demonstrated both the potential for expanding imperial effectiveness and the dangers of concentrating too much influence in any single individual. Future arrangements would need to balance these considerations, creating systems that could benefit from capable advisors while preventing the emergence of another shadow government. The solutions that emerged from this period of reconstruction would influence Roman imperial administration for generations. New protocols were established for managing imperial correspondence and appointments. Formal roles were created for imperial family members that provided meaningful responsibilities while maintaining clear boundaries. Most significantly, systems of oversight and accountability were strengthened to ensure that no future empress could accumulate the kind of unchecked influence that had made Livia so dangerous. The institutional legacy. These institutional changes represented Claudius's most important legacy, more significant even than his military conquests or public works projects. By learning from the crisis that had nearly destroyed his reign, by adapting imperial structures to address weaknesses that Livia had exploited, he created a more resilient form of government that could better withstand future challenges. The woman who had threatened to tear down the imperial system had ultimately contributed to making it stronger, though at the cost of her own life and the lives of everyone who had followed her too far into uncharted territory. As autumn deepened into winter, as Rome adjusted to the absence of its most compelling and controversial figure, as the machinery of imperial government continued its eternal work of maintaining order across a vast and diverse empire, the city began to process the extraordinary events that had shaken its foundations. The story of Livia would become legend, retold and reinterpreted by each generation according to their own understanding of power, ambition, and the eternal tension between individual desire and collective responsibility. The ripple effects, the months that followed Livia's execution, revealed something remarkable about the nature of power in ancient Rome. While the empress was gone, the systems she had influenced continued to function, but now they operated with a strange emptiness at their center, like a musical ensemble missing its lead performer. The administrative innovations she had pioneered didn't simply vanish with her death. They had become too useful, too embedded in the daily operations of imperial government to abandon entirely. Claudius found himself in the peculiar position of having to manage the legacy of someone whose actions had nearly destroyed him. The shadow government Livia had created couldn't be dismantled overnight without causing chaos. Yet allowing it to continue unchanged would risk creating another power center that might challenge imperial authority. The solution required a delicate balance between preserving what worked while ensuring no single individual could again accumulate such dangerous influence. The emperor's approach revealed political wisdom that surprised even his closest advisors. Rather than destroying Livia's innovations entirely, he began a systematic process of institutionalizing them. The informal network she had used to gather information became official intelligence services. The personal relationships she had cultivated with provincial governors, were transformed into formal diplomatic channels. Most importantly, the administrative efficiency she had brought to imperial decision-making was preserved through new bureaucratic structures that distributed responsibility among multiple officials rather than concentrating it in any single person. The social transformation, perhaps most challenging, was the question of how to handle the precedents Livia had established. Her public appearances at Senate meetings, her involvement in military planning, her role in judicial decisions, all of these activities had created expectations about imperial family participation in governance that couldn't simply be ignored. Future empresses would naturally compare their roles to hers, potentially creating pressure for similar levels of involvement that might prove equally destabilizing. Solution Claudius developed was characteristically scholarly in its attention to historical precedent and legal principle. He commissioned a comprehensive review of Roman traditions regarding women's roles in public life, seeking examples from the Republic and early Empire that might provide guidance for future arrangements. This research revealed that Roman history actually contained numerous instances of women exercising significant political influence, but almost always through established channels and recognized relationships rather than the shadow operations Livia had preferred. Using these historical examples, Claudius began creating formal roles for imperial women that would channel their ambitions and abilities in constructive directions while preventing the accumulation of unchecked power. The empress would have official responsibilities for certain aspects of palace administration, charitable activities, and diplomatic reception of foreign dignitaries. These duties carried real authority, but operated within clearly defined boundaries that prevented expansion into areas reserved for the emperor himself. The conservative backlash more significantly. These new arrangements included oversight mechanisms designed to prevent future abuses. Imperial family members would be required to report their activities to designated officials. Financial transactions above certain amounts needed imperial approval. Most importantly, any attempt to establish independent communication channels with provincial governors or military commanders would be considered treasonous by definition, removing the ambiguity that Livia had exploited so effectively. But perhaps most tragic were those who had genuinely believed in Livia's vision of a more inclusive form of Roman governance, women particularly, who had seen in her example the possibility of meaningful participation in public life. Her fall didn't just eliminate a powerful individual. It discredited an entire approach to gender relations that had begun to gain acceptance among progressive elements of Roman society. The backlash was swift and comprehensive, with traditional voices using her fate as evidence that women's involvement in politics inevitably led to corruption and chaos. This conservative reaction extended far beyond the imperial palace, affecting women throughout the empire who had been inspired by Livia's example to claim greater authority in their own communities. Wives of provincial governors found their unofficial advisory roles questioned and constrained. Wealthy women who had begun involving themselves in business decisions discovered renewed resistance from male relatives and partners. Even in the most private domestic settings, the balance of power between husbands and wives shifted back toward traditional patterns as men cited imperial precedent to justify reasserting their authority. The enduring questions, the irony was profound and painful. Livia's attempt to expand opportunities for women had ultimately resulted in their constriction. A dramatic rise and fall had provided ammunition for those who argued that female ambition was inherently dangerous, that traditional limitations existed for sound reasons, that innovation in gender relations threatened the stability of civilization itself. The very boldness that had made her extraordinary also made her example toxic for other women seeking more modest advances in their own lives. Yet, even as the immediate backlash constrained women's opportunities, Livia's legacy continued to influence Roman thought in subtler ways. The administrative innovations she had pioneered proved so effective that they couldn't be abandoned entirely. The intelligence network she had created continued to provide valuable information about potential threats to imperial security. Most importantly, the precedent she had established for imperial family involvement in governance, even within newly defined limits, created opportunities that future empresses would gradually expand through careful precedent and patient advocacy. The process of rebuilding imperial administration also revealed the extent to which Livia's influence had shaped Roman governance during her years of power. Documents discovered after her death showed that she had been involved in far more decisions than even her critics had realized. Provincial appointments, military promotions, judicial verdicts, economic policies all bore traces of her involvement. Suggestions she had made, modifications she had proposed, alternatives she had recommended. The audit of power. This documentation created both problems and opportunities for Claudius. On one hand, it provided evidence of how thoroughly his authority had been compromised. How many supposedly imperial decisions had actually originated with his wife. On the other hand, it offered insights into governance approaches that had proved effective, innovations that could be preserved even as their original author was condemned. The challenge was separating useful policies from their tainted source, maintaining what worked while rejecting what was dangerous. The emperor's solution was to conduct what amounted to a comprehensive audit of his own reign, examining every major decision made during Livia's years of influence to determine which should be continued, modified, or reversed entirely. This process took months and required the involvement of hundreds of officials who had to navigate the delicate task of criticizing policies they had previously implemented while avoiding any suggestion that they had been complicit in treasonous activities. The results of this audit revealed the complexity of Livia's impact on Roman governance. Many of her suggestions had indeed improved imperial efficiency and effectiveness. Her emphasis on gathering detailed information before making decisions had prevented several potential military disasters. Her attention to provincial concerns had helped maintain stability in regions that might otherwise have erupted in rebellion. Her focus on economic development had contributed to the prosperity that marked much of Claudius's reign. But interwoven with these genuine achievements were policies that served her personal interests rather than imperial welfare, appointments that strengthened her network of supporters rather than advancing qualified candidates, legal decisions that eliminated personal enemies rather than serving justice, economic arrangements that enriched her associates while imposing costs on the broader population. The careful balance. The challenge was identifying and reversing these self-serving elements while preserving the legitimate innovations that had benefited the empire. This sorting process required not just administrative skill, but considerable political courage. Many of the policies that needed reversal had created powerful beneficiaries who would resist change. Some of the officials who had implemented problematic decisions remained in positions where they could obstruct reform efforts. Most challenging of all, some policies had produced mixed results, combining genuine benefits with problematic side effects that made simple judgments impossible. The emperor's approach to these complexities demonstrated the analytical skills that had made him an effective scholar before his unexpected elevation to imperial power. He established review committees that examined each policy area systematically, gathering testimony from all affected parties, analyzing results against stated objectives, comparing outcomes with alternative approaches that might have been pursued. The process was methodical, thorough, and designed to reach conclusions based on evidence rather than political convenience or personal prejudice. But even the most careful analysis couldn't eliminate the political dimensions of these decisions. Every policy change created winners and losers. Every reform generated support from some quarters and opposition from others. Claudius found himself navigating factional conflicts that had been suppressed during Livia's dominance, but now emerged with renewed intensity as different groups competed to shape the post-Livia imperial system. The art of transition resolution of these conflicts required all the diplomatic skills Claudius could master, along with some he had to develop through trial and error. He learned to build coalitions that could support necessary changes while minimizing organized resistance. He discovered the importance of timing, introducing controversial reforms when political circumstances were most favorable, and delaying others until opposition could be reduced through negotiation or compromise. Most importantly, he developed the ability to frame policy changes in terms of returning to traditional Roman values rather than rejecting his wife's innovations, making reforms seem conservative rather than radical. This rhetorical strategy proved crucial for maintaining stability during the transition period. By emphasizing continuity with Republican traditions and early imperial precedents, Claudius could implement significant changes while avoiding the appearance of dramatic policy reversals that might have suggested weakness or uncertainty. The emperor, who had been mocked for his scholarly interests, now found those very qualities essential for legitimizing necessary reforms through careful attention to historical precedent and legal principle. The success of this approach gradually restored confidence in imperial governance among Romans who had been unsettled by the unprecedented arrangements of Livia's era. Traditional senators appreciated the return to more familiar procedures and relationships. Provincial administrators welcomed clarified authority structures that eliminated the confusion created by competing power centers. Even common citizens benefited from improved consistency in policy implementation, as the informal networks that had sometimes subverted official decisions were replaced by more predictable institutional arrangements. The deeper legacy, but perhaps most significantly, the careful manner in which these transitions were managed, helped prevent the kind of violent upheaval that had often accompanied major political changes in Roman history. By preserving what worked while reforming what was problematic, by respecting legitimate interests while eliminating abusive practices, by maintaining stability while implementing necessary changes, Claudius demonstrated that even dramatic political crises could be resolved through patient, methodical governance rather than purges and executions. This example would influence Roman imperial practice for generations, establishing precedents for managing transitions that future emperors would adapt to their own circumstances. The institutional arrangements developed during this period created more resilient systems of governance that could better withstand future challenges while maintaining the flexibility needed to respond to changing conditions throughout the vast Roman Empire. As winter gave way to spring, as the immediate crisis of Livia's fall receded into memory, as new patterns of imperial administration became established routine, Rome began to process the deeper implications of what had occurred. The woman who had challenged every assumption about female capability and imperial authority was gone. But the questions she had raised about power, gender, and governance would continue to influence Roman thought for centuries to come. Her story became a cautionary tale told to young women about the body of women, about the Yanbu, thing mem, Mayra Therese, with winter, the venance, with conference, would to young women the infant, the mender, the verse, dangers of ambition, unchecked by wisdom. But it also served as proof that women could excel in political leadership when given the opportunity. Her administrative innovations were condemned as examples of improper female interference in masculine domains, but they were also quietly adopted and continued by officials who recognized their practical value. Her fate was cited as evidence that traditional limitations existed for sound reasons, but it also demonstrated that those limitations could be transcended by individuals with sufficient intelligence, determination, and skill. The mirror of history The complexity of this legacy reflected the complexity of Livia herself, a figure who defied simple categorization as either hero or villain, visionary or destroyer, victim or perpetrator. She had been all of these things at different times and in different contexts, making her story a mirror in which Romans could see reflected their own struggles with the eternal tensions between stability and change, tradition and innovation, collective welfare and individual ambition. The empire she had helped to govern continued its ancient rhythms of expansion and administration, trade and taxation, war and diplomacy. But it did so with a deeper understanding of both the possibilities and the dangers inherent in concentrated power, a more sophisticated awareness of the need for institutional safeguards, and a grudging recognition that even the most cherished traditions might need to evolve to meet the challenges of an ever-changing world. In the quiet gardens where she had once walked, in the palaces where she had held court, in the Senate chambers where she had wielded influence, her absence was palpable but not absolute. The spaces she had occupied retained the memory of her presence, the echo of her voice, the lingering sense that something extraordinary had passed through those halls and left them forever changed by her passage. And yet, for all the institutional reforms and careful transitions, one question haunted the corridors of the Palatine Hill like a restless spirit. What had driven Livia to push so far beyond every boundary that even her extraordinary power couldn't protect her? The answer lay not in the grand political strategies or the calculated moves that marked her public career, but in something far more human and infinitely more tragic. The psychology of power. Those who had known her in her final months spoke of a woman consumed by a hunger that seemed to grow with every feeding. Each successful manipulation, each eliminated rival, each boundary crossed, had only intensified her appetite for more. The teenage bride who had once trembled at the thought of displeasing Claudius had evolved into someone who believed that rules were merely suggestions, that traditions existed only until she chose to ignore them. That power was a river with no banks. But power, as every Roman understood, was also a drug. And like all intoxicating substances, it demanded ever-increasing doses to produce the same euphoric effects. The influence that had once thrilled Livia with its novelty became routine, expected, insufficient. The fear she inspired in senators and nobles transformed from a tool into an addiction, something she craved not for its practical benefits, but for the pure rush of watching powerful men bend to her will. This psychological transformation had been gradual, almost imperceptible to those who observed it daily. Friends noticed that she laughed differently at her victories, with a sound that carried less joy and more hunger. Servants whispered about how she would pace her chambers late at night, restless with energies that no amount of luxury or flattery could satisfy. Even her children began to sense something unsettling in their mother's intensity, the way her attention could focus on them with frightening completeness before shifting elsewhere like a searchlight seeking new targets. The relationship with Silas had initially offered something different. Genuine partnership, intellectual stimulation, the rare experience of being challenged rather than simply obeyed. For a brief period, their connection had seemed to satisfy needs that power alone could never address. Here was someone who could match her with, appreciate her intelligence, respond to her as a woman rather than merely as an empress. The early stages of their affair had been marked by conversations that lasted until dawn, debates about philosophy and poetry that revealed depths in both participants that the brutal world of Roman politics rarely allowed to surface. The corruption of love, but even this relationship couldn't escape the gravitational pull of Livia's appetite for dominance. What began as partnership gradually shifted into another form of conquest, another demonstration of her ability to claim whatever she desired. Silas, for all his noble birth and senatorial dignity, became another trophy in her collection, proof that even Rome's most eligible bachelor could be possessed by her will. The very qualities that had initially attracted her, his independence, his aristocratic bearing, his refusal to be easily impressed, became challenges to overcome rather than traits to cherish. The wedding ceremony itself represented the culmination of this process, the moment when partnership transformed completely into possession. By forcing Silius to marry her publicly while she remained wedded to Claudius, Livia wasn't just claiming him as a husband. She was asserting her right to redefine the most sacred institutions of Roman society according to her personal desires. The man she had once loved became an instrument in her ultimate test of whether Roman civilization would bend to accommodate her will. This progression from affection to exploitation revealed something profound about the corrupting nature of absolute power. Livia hadn't set out to destroy the man she claimed to love. She had simply become incapable of maintaining any relationship that didn't ultimately serve her need for dominance and control. The woman who could manipulate senators and intimidate generals found it impossible to sustain the vulnerability that genuine love required. Every relationship became political. Every emotion became strategic. Every human connection became another opportunity to demonstrate her supremacy. The price of isolation, the tragedy, was compounded by the fact that those closest to her recognized what was happening but felt powerless to intervene. Narcissus had watched her transformation with growing alarm, understanding that each escalation made her more dangerous, not just to others, but to herself. He had tried, in his careful way, to suggest that perhaps she was moving too quickly, pushing too hard, creating unnecessary enemies through actions that served no practical purpose. But by then, Livia had become incapable of hearing warnings that suggested limitations on her power. Her servants, too, had noticed the changes. Women who had dressed her hair and managed her correspondence for years spoke quietly among themselves about how their mistress seemed to derive less pleasure from her victories, how her triumphs left her restless rather than satisfied. They watched her pace the palace corridors like a caged animal, beautiful and deadly and increasingly isolated by the very power that had once seemed to promise everything she could desire. Even her children felt the effects of their mother's transformation. Tiberius, still young enough to seek affection without calculating its political implications, found himself increasingly confused by a mother who could be tender one moment and terrifyingly focused the next. Livia loved her son genuinely, but even that maternal affection became entangled with her political ambitions. Her need to secure his future through methods that would ultimately threaten his very survival. The psychological isolation that accompanied her rise created a feedback loop that accelerated her descent into dangerous territory. Cut off from genuine human connection by her own inability to trust or be vulnerable, surrounded by people who feared her too much to offer honest counsel, intoxicated by power that seemed to validate every choice she made, Livia lost the ability to recognize when she was approaching the point of no return. The final understanding this internal journey from ambition to obsession played out against the backdrop of an empire that continued its ancient rhythms regardless of palace drama. While Livia struggled with appetites that couldn't be satisfied, Roman legions maintained order along distant frontiers. While she orchestrated the deaths of perceived enemies, merchants conducted trade that enriched provinces from Britain to Egypt. While she attempted to reshape the fundamental institutions of Roman marriage and governance, ordinary citizens lived their lives according to patterns established by centuries of tradition. This contrast between the intensely personal drama of imperial politics and the vast impersonal machinery of Roman civilization highlighted one of the most important lessons embedded in Livia's story. Individual ambition, no matter how extraordinary, ultimately crashed against the weight of collective human experience. The tradition she sought to overturn had been built through generations of trial and error, refined through countless experiments in human organization, validated through their ability to sustain complex societies across vast distances and long periods of time. Her failure wasn't primarily a failure of intelligence or even of character. It was a failure to understand the difference between personal power and institutional authority. She had confused her ability to influence events with the right to reshape civilization itself. The woman who could eliminate senators and manipulate emperors discovered too late that some boundaries existed not as arbitrary restrictions, but as essential foundations that couldn't be removed without causing the entire structure to collapse. This realization came to her only in her final hours, as she faced the consequences of choices that had seemed inevitable at the time she made them. The woman who had believed herself capable of transcending every limitation found herself reduced to the same mortality that claimed all Romans, regardless of their power or achievements. The empress, who had redefined the possible, discovered that possibility itself had limits that even her remarkable will couldn't overcome. But perhaps the most poignant aspect of her final moments was the recognition that flickered across her features as she faced execution, not regret for her ambitions or shame at her transgressions, but a kind of bewildered surprise that the rules had applied to her after all. She had lived so long in the rarefied atmosphere of absolute power that the return to ordinary human vulnerability came as a shock rather than an expected consequence. The eternal questions as spring approached and Rome began another cycle of renewal and growth. As the immediate trauma of her fall receded into the category of historical lessons rather than current crisis, the Eternal City continued its ancient work of transforming individual human dramas into collective wisdom. The woman who had briefly seemed to hold the empire in her hands was gone, but the empire itself remained, strengthened by the ordeal, wiser for the experience, more resilient for having survived its most extraordinary internal challenge. In the gardens where she had once walked, new flowers would bloom according to patterns established long before her birth and destined to continue long after her death. In the palaces where she had held court, new voices would debate the eternal questions of power and responsibility that had consumed her final years. In the Senate chambers, where she had wielded unprecedented influence, new leaders would grapple with the same tensions between tradition and innovation that had ultimately claimed her life. But they would do so with the benefit of her example, both positive and negative, to guide their choices and inform their judgment. The empire she had sought to remake had indeed been changed by her passage through it, not according to her vision, but in ways that honored the complexity of her legacy while protecting against the dangers her career had revealed. She had become part of Rome's eternal conversation with itself about the nature of power, the requirements of leadership, and the price of pushing too far beyond the boundaries that defined civilization itself. In this way, her death became not an ending but a transformation, not a conclusion but a continuation of the ancient dialogue between individual ambition and collective wisdom that had always defined the Roman experiment in governance. The woman who had believed herself capable of transcending every limitation had become herself a lesson in the importance of limits, a reminder that even the most extraordinary individuals remain subject to forces larger and more enduring than any single human will. And in that transformation lay perhaps the only kind of immortality that truly mattered, not the personal survival that she had sought through power and influence, but the institutional wisdom that her career had helped to create, the enhanced understanding of human nature and political reality that would guide future generations long after her name had faded from common memory into this province of scholars and storytellers who would continue to grapple with the eternal questions her remarkable life had raised. The empire that had condemned Livia would spend decades processing the implications of what her career had revealed about power itself. Their story would be told and retold, interpreted and reinterpreted, used to support arguments both for and against expanded roles for women in public life. Some would cite her administrative successes as proof that gender restrictions serve no practical purpose. Others would point to her ultimate failure as evidence that traditional limitations existed for sound reasons. Most would recognize the complexity of her legacy, the way she embodied both the potential and the dangers inherent in concentrated power, regardless of who exercised it. But perhaps the most enduring aspect of her influence would be the questions she raised, rather than the answers she provided. What were the proper limits of imperial authority? How could individual ambition be channeled to serve collective welfare? What institutional safeguards were necessary to prevent the emergence of shadow governments? How could the empire benefit from the talents of all its citizens while maintaining the stability that came from established traditions? These questions would occupy Roman political thinkers for centuries, driving innovations in governance that might never have been considered if Livia's career hadn't revealed their necessity. The woman who had pushed beyond every boundary had, in her failure, helped to define the boundaries that would protect the empire from future threats. Her legacy lived not in the institutions she had tried to create, but in the improvements her challenge had inspired in the institutions that survived her dot. And so ends this tale of Livia Aurelia, a woman who dared to rewrite the rules of an empire, only to discover that some boundaries cannot be crossed without consequence. Her rise from teenage bride to shadow empress reveals timeless truths about power's intoxicating nature and its ultimate limits. Though history remembers her fall, her legacy lives on in the questions she forced Rome to confront about leadership, innovation, and the eternal tension between individual ambition and collective wisdom. Perhaps that's her true immortality, not in the power she wielded, but in the conversations about possibility and restraint that her extraordinary life continues to inspire across the centuries.